Welcome to A&P Live Studio. Today, we're going to explore a really fascinating battle that's happening inside our brains every single day. It's this constant push and pull between our deliberate, goal-oriented selves and our powerful, ingrained habits. This is the story of the prefrontal cortex versus the basal ganglia. I'm your host, and as a registered nurse and anatomy and physiology instructor, what I love to do here at A&P Live Studio is break down complex medical science. We're going to connect the dots from what's happening at the cellular level all the way up to what we see in clinical practice. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start off with a real-world clinical case, and then we'll dive into the normal brain physiology behind it. From there, we'll look at what goes wrong on a molecular level, how that creates the symptoms we see, and finally, how we can use the brain's own amazing ability to change, that's neuroplasticity, to find a way forward. To make this all feel real, let's start with a person, not just a concept. We're going to look at a case of major depression to see what this neural tug-of-war actually looks like in someone's life.
So this is Elain. She's a 25-year-old college student, and she just feels, well, stuck. She's dealing with this deep lack of motivation, she can't seem to concentrate on her studies, and she finds herself spending hours and hours on her phone. But it's not really for fun, it's more of a way to avoid everything else. Now what she's feeling isn't some kind of lack of willpower. It's a direct reflection of a very specific struggle happening inside her brain.
Okay, so to really get what's happening with Elain, we first have to ask, what does a healthy brain dynamic even look like? A great way to think about the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia is to see it as a partnership between a wise manager and a very powerful habit machine.
And the entire rulebook for this whole system? Well, that's neuroplasticity. This is the brain's absolutely incredible capacity to physically change its own wiring based on what we do and what we experience. It's how we learn, it's how we adapt, but as we're about to see, it's also how things can go wrong. And, most importantly, it's how we can fix them.
So here's a really helpful analogy that kind of frames our whole discussion. The prefrontal cortex, or the PFC, is like the brain's wise manager. It's the part that handles conscious, effortful, goal-directed tasks. Then you have the basal ganglia, or the BG, which is more like the habit machine. It just executes fast, automatic routines without you even having to think about it. This slide lays out these two modes of operation just beautifully. Your PFC, the wise manager, is what you're using for anything new and hard, like, say, learning a complex clinical protocol for the first time. The basal ganglia, your habit machine, is what takes over for the routine stuff, like driving that familiar route to work. One creates the playbook, the other just runs the plays automatically. Now, if we look inside the basal ganglia itself, there's this really elegant balanced control system. It's got two opposing circuits. First, there's the direct pathway, which is driven by D1 dopamine receptors. Think of this as the go signal that helps you take action. Then there's the indirect pathway, driven by D2 receptors, which is the no-go signal that helps you suppress unwanted actions. Healthy behavior really depends on the perfect balance between these two.
Now that perfectly balanced system, that's the ideal. But what happens when it breaks down? Well, in depression, the wise manager essentially starts to lose its grip.
What we're learning is that on a molecular level, major depression is often a failure of neuroplasticity. We see literal neuronal atrophy. That's a shrinking of neurons and their connections, especially in the prefrontal cortex. This makes the PFC weaker, so it can't exert that top-down control over other brain regions as effectively. On top of that, you have blunted dopamine signaling, which leads to anhedonia, the loss of pleasure. And then you have a flood of the stress hormone cortisol, which is actually directly toxic to the PFC. And this just brilliantly illustrates the core issue of chronic stress. When cortisol goes up, the function of the prefrontal cortex goes down. It makes it so much harder for that wise manager to do its job. For healthy brain change to happen, you need a few key molecular players. Think of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, as fertilizer for your brain cells. It helps them grow. Dopamine, acting on those D1 receptors, gets the connection ready to learn. And finally, glutamate receptors are like the construction crew that physically builds the stronger connection. The problem is, in depression, this entire molecular toolkit is compromised.
So let's connect this all back to our patient. How do these changes at the cellular level actually create the symptoms that Elain is experiencing every single day?
It's a direct link. A weakened PFC? Well, that directly causes cognitive symptoms like inflexibility and the poor concentration Elain feels. When that connection between the PFC and the amygdala gets disrupted, emotional regulation starts to fail. And with the manager offline, the habit machine, the basal ganglia, takes over. That's what locks a person into those rigid negative thought patterns and the kind of avoidance habits we see with her screen time.
And this creates such a vicious cycle, because the brain's reward system isn't working right. Activities that should be pleasurable, like hanging out with friends or exercising, they just feel flat and unrewarding. So the brain defaults to low-effort, high-frequency habits, like just scrolling on a phone, which can still give these tiny, intermittent dopamine spikes. And that just reinforces the passive behavior even more.
But here's the really hopeful part. This cycle can absolutely be broken. Because of neuroplasticity, we can actively retrain the brain's manager and restore its strength. So let's look at how that works.
A therapy like behavioral activation actually works at the neural level. It starts with the patient making a conscious, deliberate choice to do something, to engage in a goal-directed action, even if there's no motivation. That simple act directly activates the dorsolateral PFC. When you repeat that activation, it triggers something called long-term potentiation, which strengthens those specific PFC circuits. And over time, this restores the manager's ability to exert top-down control over the basal ganglia's habit machine.
And this whole process is supported by a toolkit of evidence-based strategies. Mindfulness practice helps to stabilize the PFC's attention networks. Aerobic exercise is one of the best ways we know to boost that critical BDNF fertilizer we talked about. It literally helps repair and grow the connections the PFC needs. Optimizing sleep is absolutely essential, and targeted cognitive training can act like a workout for the brain, directly strengthening its inhibitory control.
Now, a really key principle here is this idea of an optimal challenge. For the PFC to actually change, it needs to be challenged, but not overwhelmed. It's really a Goldilocks situation. If there's too little cognitive load, nothing happens. Too much, and the stress response actually shuts down plasticity. The sweet spot is right in the middle. That moderate challenge is the perfect stimulus for growth.
So, to summarize our whole journey today, in depression, a weakened prefrontal cortex, our manager, loses its regulatory control over the rigid basal ganglia, our habit machine. This imbalance leads to those negative automatic patterns of thought and behavior that we see clinically. The logic of treatment, then, is to use targeted behavioral strategies to intentionally engage and strengthen the PFC, harnessing neuroplasticity to bring that system back into balance.
This leaves us with a really powerful question, not just for clinical practice, but for all of us. If our deliberate actions can physically rebuild our brain's executive manager, how can we start designing our own daily lives and our environments to better support our prefrontal health and build resilience?
Stay patho-curious, and I'll see you in the next A&P Live Studio.
This content is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any medical concerns.